Throughout the Halo series, Master Chief encounters a variety of different factions. From Master Chief's own faction, the UNSC, to the recurring enemy of the Covenant, to the Banished, the Forerunners, and the topic of today's video, the Flood. Hello everybody, and welcome to the Science Of, where today, we're taking a look at Halo's parasitic enemies, the Flood. The Flood have been in the Halo series since its inception in 2001. This ancient species is able to infect a wide variety of other species and take over their central nervous system. These parasites go through four main stages throughout their life cycle. The feral stage, which include the lowest levels of their life forms, which simply attach to hosts and try to gain energy. Then the coordinated stages, where the Flood starts to be connected by a grave mind, a sort of control center which inhabits all of the Flood. The interstellar stage, whereby the Flood can take control of technology and transport itself throughout space in order to infect more hosts. And finally, the intergalactic stage of the Flood, whereby it utilizes technology it takes from a variety of planets to be able to transport to a wider galaxy in order to infect more hosts. Now, of course, biologically, those last two stages are not possible. There are no parasites that try to use our technology as part of their life cycle. So for the purpose of this video, we'll focus on the feral and coordinated stages of the Flood and see how scientifically accurate they can be. So, we know the Floods are parasites, but what does that actually mean? Well, there are 6 different types of biological interaction that occur between species, dependent on if the impacts are positive, negative, or neutral between individuals. And these are symbiosis, parasitism, synechrosis, commensalism, amensalism, and neutralism. Starting off, we'll be taking a look at the concept of mutualism and symbiosis. The only difference between these two interactions is that mutualism occurs between members of the same or different species, whereas symbiosis only occurs between members of a different species. In both cases, the participants would not be able to exist without the other, as they are given mutually beneficial outcomes. Both of these interactions are mutually beneficial for both interacting parties, and there are many examples of it in nature, some of which you may see daily and never even think about, like the relationship between humans and their microbiome, the accumulation of all microbes that live either inside or on the human body. The most common example of mutualism is the interaction between bees and flowers, as bees take the pollen from the flower's stamens and transport it to another flower whilst collecting nectar. In this relationship, a flower's reproductive cycle is facilitated by the bees, and in turn, the bees are able to eat due to the nectar provided by the nectaries, a beneficial relationship between the bees and flowers. These are the only interactions which provide mutually beneficial outcomes for all parties involved. However, this is not to say that other positive interactions between species have to result in a negative impact towards the other species involved. Commensalism is a biological interaction which results in one party getting a benefit, whilst the other party gets neither any benefit nor experiences any harm. These kinds of interactions are common between plant life and animals, with animals using the plant life for shade and the plant life getting no benefits in return. But then on the other side, you have amensalism. This is when a biological interaction results in a negative impact towards one party, most often death, whilst having no impact upon the other. This happens quite commonly between members of the same species, and is often shown where larger members of a species exclude weaker or smaller members of the species from having good shelter or good food. In these cases, the larger members of the species would not be harmed by allowing a smaller species to share their shelter, though the smaller will definitely be harmed by the lack of shelter or food. Now, in between commensalism and amensalism, we have neutralism. This is possibly the most common interaction found in nature, as it's an interaction where neither party gets any benefit nor comes to any harm as a part of the interaction. These can apply to any species that live side by side, such as the rainbow trout present in the mountain valley and all of the flora that surrounds the body of water they inhabit around North America. And finally, we come to parasitism, the final biological interaction and the interaction which best exemplifies the Flood, so much so that they're called parasites by Halo's Covenant faction. Parasitism is the name given to a biological interaction which has a positive impact on one party whilst having a detrimental impact upon the recipient of the parasite. This negative interaction is similar to many forms of predation and herbivory. However, unlike a predator-prey relationship, a parasite is often smaller than its prey and doesn't kill its host immediately to survive, like most predators would when they need to eat. And in many cases, parasites only kill their hosts when they move on to the next stage of their life cycle, which can actually take a long time, often years. Parasitic relationships are commonly seen in diseases, whereby any bacterial infection can be a parasite, with the bacteria producing a negative impact upon the host while the bacteria gets a suitable environment to grow and spread. We actually see something somewhat similar with Halo's Flood. The Flood has two main methods of infecting hosts, the first of which is by use of pod infectors. These are the primary methods by which the Flood can infect their hosts, and normally swarms around possible victims before jumping at their chest. Once on their chest, the Flood will penetrate tentacles into their body, which connects to the victim's spinal cord. Once connected, they attack the host's central nervous system at the spine, killing the host almost instantly. After this, the pod inserts itself into the human host, moving its organs out of the way and effectively using its chest cavity and controlling it like a puppet, going so far as to change its biological shape to make it more suited for the Flood's combat needs. This use of a parasite is somewhat scientifically inaccurate, as you would expect from a series with a gun that fires a ton of glowing porcupine quills at its target. The Flood can also infect hosts through use of Flood spores. These, if inhaled, transform the host into a combat form Flood. But the real question here is, are there any real-world equivalents to the Flood? Well, we normally think of three main categories of parasite. The first of which is a microscopic parasite called a protozoa, which harms the host whilst replicating. As well as these, there are different kinds of larger parasites, the first of which is a macroparasite called helminths. Helminths normally infect their host through the ingestion of their eggs, and are relatively large parasites, being between 1mm and as far as a metre in length. These parasites are active feeders, and are effectively incredibly thin worms, which absorb nutrients through their incredibly thin skin. As well as these, there are ectoparasites, which include lice on mosquitoes, which suck blood off human hosts for their own survival. When we think of parasites like this, you may think it's complete science fiction that any of them could take over your body and control it. But there are actually multiple parasites from all three categories which can control their hosts as a part of the parasite's life cycle. Possibly the most famous example of these are the Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, otherwise known as the zombie ant fungus. These fungi infect carpenter ants in order to complete their life cycle. This parasite is somehow able to discern between different species of ants, and only releases a mind-manipulating chemical when in the presence of the carpenter ant. The reason that this fungus is only able to infect a specific species of ant is most likely due to a very close co-evolution between the two species. It's possible that every species of ant out there could have a corresponding fungus which can control it if it gets infected. Fungal cells in the ant's head release the chemicals guanidinobutyric acid and sphingosine, which work together in order to hijack the ant's central nervous system. Through this, the fungus makes the ant climb high up on vegetation and clamp down on the plant before killing it. After this, it produces a stalk which protrudes through the ant's head. This stalk releases spores which then go on to infect more ants on the ground below. Now, the zombie ant fungi might be a bit horrifying, but it's got nothing on some of the other mind-altering parasites in nature. One of these is the horrifying parasite Paragordius tricuspidatus, otherwise known as the horsehair worm. These helminths infect insects such as crickets and grasshoppers, by allowing their larvae to be eaten by the larvae of mosquitoes and mayfly, which are then eaten by the grasshoppers and crickets. Once inside a new host, the worm begins to grow and develop. The reason that this worm needs to control the cricket is that the end of its life cycle occurs in water, and in crickets, being unable to swim, are very unlikely to be found anywhere near water, so the worm needs to find a way to get them there. To do this, the worm takes control and manipulates the cricket's central nervous system with the use of chemicals, and then goes on to control the cricket towards bodies of water, causing it to drown and the worm to be released into the water to complete its life cycle. Before now, we've been talking about parasites that can control relatively small organisms, insects. But what about larger organisms? Can anything control humans like the Halo's Flood? Well, the short answer is no. No parasite can control humans with the fine control and dexterity that the Flood can do in-game, going as far as to be able to use the technology and tools that other species have developed. But there are a number of different species which can impact a human's mind in other ways. Possibly the most interesting parasite that can affect humans is Naegleria fowleri. This species of amoeba exists in bodies of stagnant water as a cyst. This cyst, when drunk, gets into contact with a host, and it will spout pseudopods. These pseudopods are temporary arms which extend from the centre of the amoeba, forming a new structure called a trophozoite, which is then able to tap into the host's central nervous system. But unlike previous examples, this simply uses the fibres of the central nervous system to move towards the brain, rather than releasing chemicals to manipulate it there. The trophozoite buries its way into the host brain at points called the olfactory bulbs, which are involved in the control of a process called olfaction. When there, the trophozoite sprouts an apparatus called an amoeba stone, which allows it to eat the brain cells. This gives the amoeba the energy needed to divide and move further into the brain, eating away at its tissues. And this can cause increasingly worrying symptoms, starting with changes to the host's sense of taste and smell, and then going on to impact the host's cognitive functions, with the host becoming confused and in turn leads to possible hallucinations. If symptoms continue, then they develop into seizures, and then unconsciousness as the amoeba finishes killing the host. So there we are. There's a parasite that's definitely as dangerous as the flood. But fortunately, these amoebas aren't able to be passed around between hosts as readily as the flood are. The flood may not be realistic parasites, and in some ways, the real parasites can actually be more terrifying than the sci-fi alternative. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please like and subscribe, and tell me if there's anything you'd like to see me cover in future videos down below. But until then, this has been the Science of the Flood. I'll see you next time.